Okay, students, let's continue. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. So, in the story, the author starts about his grandmother. So, he's telling about how his grandmother was an old lady. She had wrinkles on her face. And here, he tells how people said that she was once young and pretty and even had a husband. So, here you find the author trying to add sarcasm in his writing. So he's trying to make a sort of a ridicule in his writing, right? See the way he tells it. He tells she had once been young and pretty, and even had a husband. See how he's trying to add sarcasm in his writing, but that was hard to believe. Next, my grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. You can see a fireplace. Above the fireplace, you can see the mantelpiece, and then you can see a portrait hanging above the mantelpiece. And then he goes on describing about his grandfather. Okay, he wore a big turban. So I think you would be knowing what is a turban. Normally, when you see Punjabis, right, they'll be having a cloth tied around their head, right? So that is called a turban, right? And loose-fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. Now, please take a look at this picture. Here is the picture of a man, of an old man who has the looks of the grandfather in the portrait. So you can see this. You can see him wearing a big turban with a long white beard covering the best part of his chest. Now again, when he's talking about his grandfather, he's again trying to bring sarcasm in his writing, right? So you see how he's trying to describe his grandfather. He looked at least 100 years old. He did not look the sort of person who would have wife or children. So when you look at the grandfather, you will not say that he had wife or children. Then he goes on saying he looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. So he's saying, if you look at the grandfather, it didn't seem that he had wife or children, but it looked as if he had lots and lots of grandchildren. So that is the sarcasm in his writing. And again he continues about his grandmother. As for my grandmother, being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. So whenever the thought about his grandmother, right, being young, being pretty, was being told to him, he was not able to accept it. That's what he means by revolting. He rejected the thought that his grandmother would have been young and pretty, right? And then he says she often told us of the games she used to play as a child. That seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. Now, normally grandmothers, right, when they sit along with the grandchildren, they tell a lot of fairy tales. Now, when the author hears about how she was in a young age, he's not able to believe that she would have played such games. It was like believing a fairy. It was something like a fairy tale to him. So I was not able to believe that his grandmother would have been young and would have played such games in a young age. He was not able to believe that. Okay, let's continue. Now he tells about the features of his grandmother. She had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Short, fat, and bent. Normally, when people grow old, they try to bend a little, right? So that's what he's talking about his grandmother. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. You can see an old woman, right, whose face resembles almost that of the grandmother in the story, with wrinkles running all over her face. No, we were certain she had always been as we had known her. Old, so terribly old, that she could not have grown older and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. See, the grandson had been with the grandmother for 20 years. And being with the grandmother for 20 years, he could not see any visible change over her. See, this happens also with us. When you are living with our parents, when you are living with other family members, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, and all that, for us, we don't see any visible change over them. Since we are growing with them, we don't see any visible change over them. But when a relative, right, visits your house after a long time, they'll be able to identify the change. But being in the house every day, seeing them and being in the house along with them, for you, that change is not so visible. That was the same issue with the grandson. So for 20 years he has been looking at his grandmother, and he was not able to see any noticeable change in her. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She hobbled about the house in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stool. Take a look at the next picture. Here you can see how the grandmother hobbles about the house in spotless white, having her hand resting on her waist to balance her stool. He tells that she hobbled, that is, she moved very slowly, walked very slowly. And while she is walking, she used to keep one hand on her waist, one hand on her hip, so to say, right? In order to balance, because he told his grandmother was slightly bent. In order to maintain that balance while walking, she used to keep one hand on her waist and walk. And she used to always have a rosary in her hand, right? You can see the picture of rosary here. This is how the rosary looks. Right? So rosary has small beads, right? And she used to roll the beads in the rosary and tell her prayers. Then her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. So it tells how it talks about her hair. Silver locks means, see, when if you look at the old people, they'll have white hair, right? They'll have gray hairs, and this grandmother, she had gray hair, and normally if you would have watched ladies, they'll at the back they'll try to lock their hair, and when they lock it, sometimes the loose hairs will be scattered all over the face. So that's what he's talking about his grandmother here. So, and he tells how her lips constantly moved in inaudible. What's the meaning of inaudible? Without noise. She used to pray. She was praying, but you cannot hear that. You cannot hear that noise. So silently she was. In other words, she was silently rolling her beads, and she was telling a rosary. Then again he says, yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, the expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. Now, just take a look at this picture of the landscape in the mountains. Now, he's trying to compare the appearance of his grandmother to the winter landscape in the mountains. Right? How the mountains seem to be, covered with snow, covered with the clouds, with the snow, and appear to be white. He tries to compare his grandmother being like that. And he tells that his grandmother, she had a sort of, a peace within her, and she seemed to have a contented look. So that's what he's talking about with grandmother. So let's see what we have covered till now. So here the author starts about describing his grandmother being old, having wrinkles on her face, didn't seem to have any change for the last 20 years. Then he talks about the grandfather. He gives a description of the grandfather. Then he tells about, his grandmother. He's not able to believe that she was young, that she had been young, she had played games when she was young. He has been living with his grandmother for 20 years, and he was not able to believe that she passed to that young age and has come to this old age. He's not able to accept that. And he talks about her, he talks about her physical features. Then he talks about the facial features, which had wrinkles all over. Then he tells about her hair, how she had her hair locked up, right? And how her hair was scattered all over her face. Then he tells about how she used to always move around the house. She used to walk slowly around the house, trying to support, trying to maintain her balance by keeping one hand on her waist, right, to balance that stool. Then he tells about how she constantly prayed by rolling the beads of a rosary. Then at last he tells about her appearance, how her appearance looked like the winter landscape in the mountains, and how she had a sort of a serenity, how she had a sort of a peace in her, and how she had a look of contentment in her. So that's what we saw till now.